Hey everybody, how are you? I am just getting settled in here. Just give me one quick minute. How do I make this thing bigger? Maybe like this? Yeah, perfect. How are you? I'm so excited. I was just live with the founder of Corbin, Greg Lambrecht, and we had some amazing wines open. I thought maybe I'd jump over here and talk to you guys about them because they were absolutely mind-blowing. So the theme for this particular live stream was something I really love doing and something I probably do personally do a little bit better than maybe some other people, which is Napa Valley old wines. So we're diving back into the 70s and the 80s, 90s to talk about the history of Napa Valley, the stylistic preferences of these particular decades and producers. So just to give you a little overview of what we tasted, because it was pretty extraordinary. We did Corbin everything. So this is a Corbin. If you've never seen that, this is a pretty cool system. I'll show you how it works in just a little bit, where you actually put this contraption on top of the bottle and you pour it and never have to actually remove the cork, which is amazing. So you can open many different bottles without ever actually having to open them. So we started with a 1975 Clos Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon. Then we went to the 1987 Chateau Montelena Chardonnay, and then the 1990 Frog's Leap Merlot. And then we finished up with the 1997 Caymus Special Selection. So just such a treat. This is something that I haven't done in a minute. For those of you who don't know this already, I left Press as their wine director a few months ago. So I don't taste old wines as much as I used to, which is a crying shame for many different reasons. But I wanted to share these with you guys because one, it's just so much fun, and two, I just don't get the opportunity to do it that often. So the 1975 Clos Reserve, we'll just jump right into it. This is actually a really cool wine. So Clos a long history in Napa Valley. It was started in the early 70s. It was actually one of the first French-American collaborations in Napa Valley. So it was a family in Bordeaux. They chose Stag's Leap District, where this wine is from, where the winery was built, because it's a little cooler there. So when you look at Napa Valley, Stag's Leap sits about midway to 3/4 of the way down south if you look at the valley north to south. And it's in this really interesting microclimate where there is a wind that kind of comes through there that cools everything down, and it makes it have just a little bit longer of a growing season. So, and of course, wind is also good for thicker skinned grapes. So they settled on this particular property in Stag's Leap District. This wine is actually made from vines that were only about 4 years old. So they were planted, this is a 1975. They were planted in 1972. And then it also has a few purchased grapes from a vineyard not too far from where Clos is in Stag's Leap District, which is now Odette Winery. So it's just a little bit north of that. It used to be called the SDS Vineyard, and those vines weren't that old as well. And the reason I say that is because there's a lot of talk about whether or not old vines make a difference in a wine. And I think to a certain extent they do, but there's also some really incredible wines that have been very age-worthy and delicious that have come from vines that were only, a few years old. So, something that we talk about often, but nobody really seems to know whether or not old vines makes a difference or not. So what I love about this wine, I mean, you think of 75 Napa Valley Cabernet. Is it going to age? Is this a wine even worth drinking? You think about some of these older bottles and you think about Napa Valley now and you're like, is this a wine that would have stood the test of time? And the answer is yes. And this is what I want to tell you. Over the time that I worked at Press, this was something that I loved discovering because Napa Valley is a wine region that can and should age. It's a beautiful region. Wines in the 70s, a little bit more rustic in style, more Bordelais, more European in style. There were heavy stylistic influences from the likes of Andrei Telechev, who's really the father of American and Californian winemaking. You had Robert Mondavi really leading the charge. It was very much a sharing economy in that way in Napa Valley in the 60s and 70s. So as a result, not only do you have more Bordeaux tendencies because of the owners of this vineyard, but also because it was just sort of the style. So on the nose, super, super savory. I mean, you think of, if you've ever driven around California, especially Northern California, if you've driven around the redwoods, that's kind of what this smells like. It's a little bit sappy and sweet, a little bit green, but also a little bit fruity. You think of that sort of redwood, that like kind of red earth, that red bark. and it's, it smells like fruit. It's really gorgeous. I am actually going to pour a little bit more in my glass and show you guys how this Corbin works. If you've never seen this before, this is an amazing contraption. This was invented, I don't even know how many years ago, at least a decade, but it basically goes on over top of this. You'll see there's a needle. So this needle here is actually going to go into the cork. So you never pull the cork out of the bottle. So we're just going to set it up here like this. You push it down. Ta-da, now the needle's in there. And what is inside here is an argon capsule. And so what happens is the wine comes up out of here, and at the same time, argon, which is a neutral gas that is a little heavier than air, replaces the oxygen that would be in there and helps to stabilize the wine and preserve it. So just a really brilliant system. Corbin set, and then basically what happens here is you click this little button here, and you'll see. There we go, and the wine comes out. Beautiful. So you can kind of click this and make it faster or slower. But interestingly, these are amazing for a few different reasons. One, Corbin says you can keep them for years, literally, and they never really go bad, and that's why we love them. But also, another little thing that I love about it is if you've ever had a few bottles of wine open at once, you know that once that cork comes out, trying to get back in and like fit it back in your fridge is really, really challenging. And so I love that the cork stays in perfectly, and you can just lay it back down. You can stand it up. Of course, this being an older bottle, we're probably going to lay it down so the cork doesn't dry out too much. You do want to be a little bit careful, but I do love that aspect of the Corbin. It's just a beautiful, beautiful product that has been a lifesaver during the COVID times. Please make a video on wine pairings. All right, noted. All right, so, oh, there it is. There's that red woody kind of eucalyptus, a little bit of that menthol. It's a eucalyptus that isn't, don't think of like going to a spa eucalyptus. Think of these redwoods, and it's a really unique scent to Northern California that I love. It reminds me of like fall drives up there. It's a little bit evergreen, so like kind of like a Christmas time tree sappy smell. But then on the palate, holy moly, massive intensity, huge fruit, really, really dark. Acid for days. And when we think about wines that are this old, we assume that the acid will have diminished. We assume that it's not going to be there. And acid is the backbone of a wine, acid and tannin. And there is tanker loads of that in this glass. This is a wine, you think of tannin, there's tannin, but it's very resolved, they're very soft, so they're not drying tannins. They're just there to support the wine. From a fruit standpoint, very dark fruit, it's still very much there. We also expect a wine this old to only sort of be living in its secondary and tertiary flavors. And I think, to an extent it's there, but it's not just tertiary. It is fruit, and there is something there beyond just the earthiness of the wine. And sometimes when we get into wines that are 30, 40 years old, we lose some of that fruit and we're just into the dirty stuff. It tastes like a bowl of overturned or bowl of potting soil, right? But this is a wine that still has tons and tons of fruit on it. It's got great acid. It is a wine that clearly has stood the test of time. 75 was a vintage that it was an interesting vintage. It was a cold winter and a cold spring, but a pretty mild summer. And so vintages, when you think of them, you have to think about how the grapes performed and what it meant for harvesting. So cold, wet, rainy spring, means the vines probably got a lot of moisture in them, the earth did. So really nice heavy fruit set, but the summer really, really mild, so not a lot of heat, which means that it took longer for those grapes to ripen. So as a result, you had this really long time before harvest ever happened because you needed that sunlight to come in and start getting the sugars to accumulate in the grapes. And so in 1975, it took a really long time for that to happen. And unfortunately, what did happen was it took so long that we started getting into these autumn rains that often happen in California and Napa Valley. So a wine that wasn't a great vintage, but a vintage that wasn't a great vintage, but wines that have produced vintages that produce really beautiful wines despite all of that. And I think that's really important. 75s in general for me have been really super sturdy wines. They're not blousy, they're not mousy, they're not super fruity. They're just sturdy and structural. So a really, really beautiful embodiment of a bottle of wine that is, 40-ish years old, right? Okay, so Chardonnay. Does Chardonnay age? Well, yes, of course Chardonnay ages. It's beautiful when it ages. This is 1987 Chateau Montelena Chardonnay. Chateau Montelena, another iconic producer, something I probably should have mentioned about the Clos de Val. If you've ever heard of the Judgment of Paris, this is a sort of a wine tasting competition that's very famous. It was called the shot heard around the world. I think there was actually another phrase attributed to it, but cover of Time magazine. This was Steven Spurrier's claim to fame. They put some California wines up against some French wines, and the California wines, they won. So it was a very, very important moment in California history. And interestingly, the Clos de Val wines were in the Judgment of Paris, did very well. But the Chateau Montelena from 1973 or 74, that was actually the wine that won the Judgment of Paris on the white side of things. So a really, really monumental winery for Napa Valley's history, and certainly winery that got to be known for their Chardonnay. This is from 1987. You can see the color is nice and golden. So what happens with white wines as they age is, red wines, we lose a little color, they start to change a little bit, but white wines, they actually intensify in golden with age. They must oxidize, and you think of like an apple. It's essentially what's happening in the white wine glass. So you get a little bit more of that golden richness in the color. Perfectly normal for a wine of this age, just 33 years old, the same age as me. And this is a beautiful representation of a Chardonnay from California with age on it. And you think of, if you ever had Old Burgundy, if you've been lucky enough to have some Old Burgundy, like some Old Corton Charlemagne or Old Merlot, that is sort of what this smells and tastes like. If you haven't, no problem, we're going to talk about it. So this is a wine that smells a lot like honey, like a not sweet honey, but like a beeswax honey. So a fresh honey, and then a little bit of apple. So like bruised golden apples. So if you've ever had Chenin Blanc, it smells a little like Chenin Blanc. And there's just a really pretty, beautiful white acacia florality to this wine. It doesn't smell sweet. It just smells a little waxy and a little bit like a little rich. Let's check out the palate. Now, here's where it gets good. So all of that beautiful richness that you have on the nose, it's translating to the palate, but you've also got a massive amount of acidity, and that is the hallmark of a great white wine. You want there to still be a little bit of acidity, if not a lot. So we think of how a white wine ages. Acidity is the thing that you want to look for, in addition to great flavor. And does it taste good overall? But acidity is really the hallmark of a really well-aged white wine. I always find cooler vintages to stand the test of time. I think that's a really good point. Cooler vintages have been the wines that traditionally have aged the longest. You have a few exceptions here and there, but you think of 1998, a really cold, wet, rainy vintage in Napa Valley. We're going to taste the 97 in just a second because that's a hot vintage, a vintage that changed a lot of things in Napa Valley. But 98, a lot of people really love because it's a wine that has a little bit more acidity, a little bit more structure. It wasn't so ripe. And a lot of times what can happen is these riper vintages just don't have the acid to support longevity when it comes to aging. So 87, I will say, a really hot vintage, super hot summer, very dry winter. A fairly big crop as well. So a wine that you wouldn't have expected to have as much acidity. I do think, and this was sort of a style of the time, I do think there was a gentle amount of acidification that happened in this wine, meaning they actually added acid to this to help with that. Not surprising for a vintage like 87, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's actually really helped this wine. If you love richer, so here's what I'll say about older Chardonnays and whether or not you may like them or not like them. If you're someone who loves a little bit more of a rich Chardonnay, if you're someone who traditionally loves a little bit of oak, maybe not necessarily butter, but you love texture in your white wines, an aged white wine like a Chardonnay is going to be a really good wine for you because it gives you all of that, but it's in a totally different capacity. So where you might get more of that spicy baking spices, more of that vanilla from oak, or even the butteriness that you might get from from it going through malolactic fermentation. You're getting all of that richness and that viscosity from a different place, and it's giving you a totally different flavor profile. So I think it's super cool about aged white wines, and I try to drink them when I got the opportunity. This is certainly a beautiful one, and I will say these all came directly from the winery. We're super lucky to get those. 1990 Frogs Leap Merlot. I know Merlot, still trying to make its comeback after its demise during Sideways. I love Merlot. I think it's a beautiful grape. It gives you everything that you want from Cabernet, but it's a little bit more on the pruny side of things. It's always got like a little bit more plushness to it. Texturally, it's always a little bit softer. I think this particular wine is gorgeous, and it reminds me of Pomerol, like something from the right bank of Bordeaux, which is traditionally, of course, Merlot based. This wine is savory, but also very Californian. So where the Clos d'Aval was a little bit more Bordelais, this feels Californian, but restrained. And that's sort of indicative of Frogs Leap as a whole. Frogs Leap has always been on the forefront of organic and sustainable farming practices. Really since their inception. John Williams, the co-founder, he founded the winery with Larry Turley in the 80s. He was really the one that decided to start pushing all of the growers to move to organic farming, and really was instrumental in that movement before it was even a movement. So really, really cool for Frogs Leap to be part of this tasting. Since then, they have continued those practices. They continue to push what is possible with regenerative farming, with no-tilling, with really trying to find ways to keep what the grapes are growing in, the soil, the terroir, healthy, revitalized, and as a result, you of course get better grapes. This is a really gorgeous wine. I fell in love with the 1990 Merlot from Frogs Leap many years ago. And I remember it struck me. I was like, this tastes like right bank Bordeaux. It's so delicious. I need more of this. And, a wine that I just think has done incredibly well. I also think that Merlot is something that you can often go to for older wines and find at a fraction of the price. So where a Cabernet might be $250, $350, oftentimes you can get Merlot for about half that. So really, really pretty wine, plushy, has great acidity, doesn't quite have the intensity of the Cabernet from Clos d'Aval, but if you've been interested in trying something older, this is a really good place to go. We are going to go to the Caymus 1997. This is really cool because the Caymus in 1997 was a really important vintage in Napa Valley for a few reasons. One, it was a super hot vintage that produced a massive, massive crop. So you think about what would have been happening in that time. 97, you think about the harvest, right? So a lot of grapes in the vine, they're all really beautiful. It's super hot. But we're in the winery and we have no place to put them. We bring in, normally 50 tons, and what's out in the vineyard is like 100. So where is this all supposed to go? So basically what happened was you had a hot vintage and a lot of fruit. So a lot of the fruit hung on the vines for an extended period of time because there was just simply nowhere else for it to go. So 97 was a vintage that sort of by accident became a very overly ripe vintage that then manipulated the scores to a certain extent come early 2000s. So 97, you had people that were making wines that were, as high as this is 14.4% alcohol. That was sort of a game changer. 94, you had that too, but this was sort of across the board in 1997. And it really struck a chord with the vintners of that era who looked at these scores coming out of 97 and said, well, if we can get really high scores based on ripeness, based on extended hang time, maybe we should keep doing that. And that is really sort of what progressed Napa Valley into the last 2 decades that we've had with big over-the-top wines that were higher alcohol. And it really was the change in course that dictated the last 2 decades in stylistic preferences when it comes to winemaking. So 97, a really, really instrumental vintage. Caymus, of course, being a winery that embraced that. They have always made wines that were of the time. So in the 70s and 80s, when the winemaking style was a little bit more restrained, when the trend was to acidify, that's what they were doing. Come 97, when the trend was to have a little bit more brightness, to embrace the California sunshine. That's what they were doing. And I've always loved Caymus for that. They've always not only been with the times, but in many cases ahead of the time. And I think this is a perfect example of that wine, a wine that is beautiful and ripe, drinking absolutely gorgeously and beautifully right now, but also still has like a really gorgeous savory nose. It's not just, big ripe fruit. There is this sort of like eucalyptus menthol thing going on. Very, very red, very deep, very viscous. You're someone that loves big Napa cabs, but you don't love them so young because the tannins sort of dry your mouth out and it's too much intense structured tannins. I encourage you to try a wine like this with a few years of age on it, to see if you like that a little bit better. We're not digging into some of the things that we're getting with the Clos de Val. We're not into the overturned earth, the potting soil, more of the savoriness. You're only getting that a smidge on the nose. And I think this is a really perfect wine for someone that loves youthful, vibrant, fruit-forward wines, but doesn't want so much of the intensity and so much of the structure. So a beautiful, beautiful wine. 4 very different wines, obviously from the same general region. And I hope that you've found this helpful. This has been super fun. I have now been live for the past 2 hours, so I'm going to go eat some food. And thank you guys for joining me this time around. And I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.